All right.
Okay. So, my presentation is about genes causing addiction. My research question: how do and what genes cause addiction? Introduction. Many genes have been found in research that correlate to substance abuse. Genetics play a role in family history, how people react to the environment, and other disorders that serve as risk factors to developing an addiction. In this presentation, I will discuss just how much genes influence the development of an addiction and how genes can adapt to sustain an addiction. So, what is an addiction? A state of psychological or physiological dependence on both on the use of alcohol or other drugs. The APA also states that genes are over half the cause of addictions forming. What is a gene? So genes contain our heredity, and genes consist of two alleles, and they can be the same or different, and if they are different, that is considered a polymorphic gene. The polymorphic gene is the first level of genetic variation that can give rise to individual behavioral differences. So if someone is acting abnormal or whatever, then it's due to a polymorphic gene. Oh, okay. So how these work: DNA codes for a protein, and the gene then controls the production of the protein through RNA. When RNA is synthesized, only part of the protein is represented, and not all genes are expressed all the time or at all. So that can explain the switching on and off of genes. So why someone may have a problem early in life and then later, or vice versa. So family history is a huge risk factor for developing an addiction, and looking at that can provide meaningful insight into the likelihood of someone developing an addiction. In fact, children of alcoholic parents are 4 times more likely to become alcoholics themselves compared to children who grew up with parents who didn't abuse alcohol. And babies of alcoholic parents adopted into new homes possess the same amount of risk as if they were not adopted. So that just goes to show how much genes impact someone, whether or not they are with parents who abuse alcohol or in the environment or not. And typically genes impact someone's reward pathway, so how they feel after using a drug and their responses to substances. So genes in their environment. So a lot of times it comes down to the right configuration of events. So where they are, what they used, who they're with, their mental state at the time. That all goes into whether or not an addiction can be triggered after using a substance. And it's important to note that drug use is not inherited, the risk is, and the environment can trigger the substance use. Genetics influence our reaction to the environment as well, so how we can react to stress or trauma. And triggers and risk factors include mental health, trauma, stress, our social environment, so our friends we hang out with at school or on other activities, and then our home environment with family. And then mental illness and substance abuse are commonly co-occurring. So sometimes if someone is depressed, they can use substances, or if they start a substance, they can then become depressed. It's hard to tell which one comes first, but they often make each other worse. And then another big topic with environment is in the home, and that involves parenting styles. So the 4 parenting styles are authoritative, neglectful, permissive, and authoritarian. And research has shown that authoritative is consists of praising children for accomplishments while providing guidelines and encouragement to improve on success. So this type of parenting encourages and teaches emotion regulation and problem-solving strategies. So if a child is learning this from a young age from their parents, learning emotion regulation and problem-solving strategies will help them be able to deal with stress or trauma or other triggers that would usually cause or could cause them to turn to substances over other ways to deal with it. So there's 2 interesting ways that people can become addicted. One is instant dependence, and that's called getting hooked after one use. And this type of dependence requires an extreme amount of predisposition. So this is like when someone just goes to a football game with friends and has one drink and then instantly can't stop. And then neuroadaptation is continued substance use to feel a desired effect can cause genes to adapt to the use. And this requires no genetic marker or predisposition. And once these genes change for the substance use, those genes can then be passed down to children. So then their children will be predisposed even though that individual was not. So some certain genes that were found correlating to the substance use was the H2K and the RASGRF2 phenotype. And the H2K is a virus on this phenotype. It's near the dopamine. It kind of regulates dopamine. And it's relating to intravenous drug use. So the RASGRF2 is a gene involved in signaling pathways in dopaminergic activity, thus related to addiction. And H2K is found on the RASGRF2 more frequently in intravenous drug users than any other drug users. Another gene is the ChRNA2, and it's commonly found with cannabis use disorder. Low levels of this gene is in the cerebellum is correlated to cannabis use disorder. One study found 400 plus locations with 566 gene variants having to do with smoking and alcohol use. And the CUL3, PDE4B, and PTGR3 are all locations in a sequence that are involved in smoking and alcohol. And some other genes is alcohol dehydrogenase 2 gene, and that interferes with the breaking down of alcohol. Dopamine receptor gene has to do with your reward pathway and is commonly found with opioids, cocaine, and alcohol. The mu opioid receptor gene has two variants. One can either cause alcohol dependence, or one is commonly found in opioid abusers. Cholinergic receptor nicotinic alpha 5 subunit. That is correlated with nicotine dependence, and this gene is responsible for sensing nicotine in the body. So, addiction has a lot to do with epigenetics, which is the study of functional and sometimes inherited changes in the regulation of gene activity and expression that are not dependent on gene sequence. And histones actually provide structure for genes by tightening and loosening them, which then affect expression. So drug use affects the histone. So sometimes the histone will tighten around a DNA, then making it produce more or less proteins that will influence the addiction and someone's response to the substance. So there's been a lot of research about treatment using genes, and there's gene therapy, and there's a couple methods of that, and that's gene silencing and repairing mutations. Repairing mutations, it's targeting and repairing the messenger mRNA transcripts copied by the mutated gene. And then gene silencing is exactly how it sounds. They find the gene, and then they'll repair it in a way that silences it from producing the proteins. Or there's medicine to counteract protein production based on the gene identified. And these are my references.